There are places that hold stories that few dare to tell. The morgue is one of them. Among silent corridors and cold rooms, those who work in this environment know the thin line between the ordinary and the unexplainable. For many, it is merely a place of farewells. For others, it is a setting of mysteries that defy any explanation. Today, you will hear accounts from those who spend their days and nights in this place, stories that may never find an explanation, but that, for those who experience them, are impossible to ignore. Good evening, Dom. My name is Noemia. I've been working in the funeral industry for years, and I've seen it all, but some experiences still give me chills. I want to share a story I went through recently, something that has left me without answers to this day. My professional journey has always been tied to the world of funeral services. I've worked in various morgues over the years, and although there's still much to learn, I've gathered enough knowledge to understand the complexity of this field. I've worked in different places that taught me valuable lessons, some good, others not so much. And still, there is always something that surprises me. About the unexplainable, I've already experienced situations that, no matter how much I try to rationalize, I can't fully understand. But none of what I've gone through compares to what I'm about to share now. I currently practice my profession in a state near the center of the country. I'm not afraid to reveal my name, but I prefer to keep the exact location a secret, simply because what happened is recent. At the funeral home where I work as an embalmer, I share responsibilities with Mr. Lorenzo. Let's call him that, since he doesn't even know I'm telling this story. He's in charge of the embalming sector and the morgue. We've worked together for 2 years, and that day when I arrived from my daily commute, he greeted me with a warning. We had a complicated case ahead. When you hear that, your mind wanders through countless possibilities. Even so, we moved forward. That was his way of preparing me for what was coming. Maybe the body of a child, always more emotionally challenging, or a severe physical condition. Upon entering the morgue, I dropped off my belongings and went to where a body was already waiting for us. By its size, I realized it wasn't a child, but an adult. The corpse was covered by a sheet, and as I organized my materials, I greeted Lorenzo, who immediately informed me that we would start working without delay. Today we have a tough job. Time is short and the case is complicated. I'll show you and explain why. I approached the gurney. When Lorenzo pulled back the sheet, it revealed a man showing signs of premature aging. His face, marked by scars and wrinkles, made him look older than he really was. I won't go into overly graphic detail because that's not the point. Still, I need to mention something so you can understand how challenging this process would be. His eyes remained open, but his features were unrecognizable. Entire parts were missing, including the structure of his nose and cheeks. Despite the thick mustache and dense beard, it was clear that the lower portion of his mouth was not in place. I hope this is enough to convey the difficulty. No matter how much experience I had in the field, that man affected me in a way I can't explain. Yes, his condition was one of the worst I'd ever worked on, but there was something beyond that. Something about him gave me a restlessness I couldn't name. Maybe it was simply the brutality of the scene before my eyes. "Noemia, let's begin," said Lorenzo. Male, 35 years old. He crossed the street without looking, according to witnesses, and was hit by a car. Despite the injuries, he arrived at the hospital still alive, but he didn't survive very long. A few hours later, he died. Now he's here. While processing his words, I looked at him, trying to understand. Yes, it was a difficult case. But was it that difficult? Yeah, normally when a body arrives in this condition, the family chooses to keep the coffin closed. But in this case, they don't want that. They insist on an open casket wake, and as you can see, we have a big challenge ahead of us if we're to make him look more acceptable. That's why I warned you we'd have a lot of work. It's one of those demanding families who pay well but expect impeccable results. We don't have much time, but it'll work out. He said that with the confidence of someone who's faced similar situations. Those who work in this field understand the family's desire. They want to say goodbye, see him one last time, remember him as he was in life, just looking like he's asleep. But from our side, the difficulties were obvious. It wasn't just an aesthetic issue, it was a technical and emotional challenge, and the open casket decision wasn't ours to make. Lorenzo called me again. "Let's get started. I'm already getting the materials ready." While he organized everything, I stood there looking at the man on the gurney. There was something about him, something that unsettled me, but I tried to ignore it and began my work. My role, when Mr. Lorenzo was around, was to prepare the body and apply restorative makeup to soften the damage. This time, we would have to go the extra mile, but fortunately, I wasn't alone. I focused on the areas that needed coverage. The body had already been cleaned in the morgue, so there was no more of that red liquid that, so they say, can't even be mentioned on YouTube. But the sight of his mouth disturbed me. Everything was exposed in such a way that you didn't need to move anything to see what was there. And more than that, I felt a strange sensation come over me. Feeling sadness when seeing a body wasn't unusual for me. I always tried to imagine the person's last moments, the pain they felt, the fight for life that in the end, they lost. This man remained conscious for a while after the accident, and the pain he must have endured is unimaginable. I tried to calm myself, remembering that even after years of work, certain cases still got to me. But this was different. Being close to that body made me feel an uneasiness beyond compassion. Suddenly, being near him sparked a revulsion in me that I couldn't explain, as if something inside me was telling me not to stay there. As usual, I did what I always do before I start working. Many of us in this profession have this habit. We say a few words to the deceased, we pray silently, we ask forgiveness for the disturbance, and we state that we are here to help them find peace. I did that and began. Despite how severe his condition was, the mustache and beard were an advantage. They would help conceal part of the damage. With that in mind, we decided to tidy them up. As we worked, talking about the procedures, Lorenzo suddenly asked, "This man has something strange about him, don't you think?" The question caught me off guard. I thought I was the only one feeling that way. I was already overwhelmed by confusing emotions, more than usual, and hearing him voice that thought made me even more alert. Something wasn't right, but I preferred not to dwell on it. Maybe it's just because of how he ended up after the accident, and the way he died, I replied, trying to dismiss the idea that there was more to it. Lorenzo nodded, as if trying to convince himself that it was just that. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't satisfy me at all. A little while later, as Mr. Lorenzo tried to fasten the jaws together, he suddenly jerked his hand back and stepped away, as if he'd been shocked. I looked at the deceased man's mouth, trying to see what had happened, but saw nothing unusual. When I turned to face him, I noticed something rare. He was frightened. "What happened? Are you okay?" He shook his head and tried to play it down. "It's nothing, everything's fine," but his tone wasn't convincing. Even so, he approached again and tried once more to fix the mouth in place. And just like before, he reacted the same way, pulling his hand back as though something had repelled him. "I'm going to take a break. I don't know why, but I'm nervous," he said. That caught me by surprise. I'd never seen him lose his composure in the middle of a job. Without further explanation, he walked to the sink, took off his gloves and washed his hands, then headed to the restroom. I was left alone with the body on the gurney. Mr. Lorenzo's reaction didn't make sense, and he hadn't explained anything, but something made him recoil. Maybe I was exaggerating, but I needed to understand. I stepped closer and tried to do what he couldn't. I placed one hand on the upper part of the mouth and the other on the lower part, attempting to close them together. That was when I realized what had scared him. Over the years, I've worked on many bodies. My main focus has always been restorative makeup, but when necessary, I also handle embalming. I'm well aware of the usual reactions in a corpse, the natural stiffness, and the difference between a living body and a dead one. At first, I felt the typical resistance to movement, but suddenly something different happened. A force was pushing back against keeping the jaw shut. It was as if the body itself was trying to open its mouth by its own will, fighting my pressure. That kind of stiffness doesn't exist. Bodies can have spasms, involuntary reflexes, but the mouth reopening every time I closed it, as if something inside was resisting. That wasn't normal. My reaction was even stronger than Mr. Lorenzo's. I let go abruptly and screamed. He, still in the bathroom, heard my outcry and came rushing out. Seeing me pale and stuttering, he wanted to know what happened. The mouth, it moved by itself. By then we were long past the stage of expecting any natural reaction. That wasn't a spasm, nor was it some post-mortem reflex. Something there was beyond what science could explain. Lorenzo didn't take long to realize what I'd tried to do. He approached, trying to calm me. "This happens sometimes, it's normal, they're just bodily reactions," he said, trying to sound composed. But I knew he didn't believe his own explanation. If it was something common, he wouldn't have been so startled the first time. I preferred not to argue. After a moment, we prayed. I read somewhere that it helps, that some souls refuse to depart, and that prayers can ease this process. Somehow, I felt this might be one of those cases. When we returned to work, Lorenzo managed to close the man's mouth without any more issues, but the feeling that something was amiss lingered. While he finished that procedure, I started thinking about how we would deal with the missing cheekbones. That's when something even more disturbing happened. The deceased man's eyes, which had remained open the entire time, began to glisten, as if he were about to cry. I know it sounds impossible, but that's exactly what I saw happening right in front of me. My boss noticed it too. He brought his fingers close to the man's eyelids to close them, but as soon as he touched his eyes, tears started slowly rolling down his cheeks. "Look, you know what? Let's leave him alone for a moment. This man has something that's keeping him from leaving. That's what I feel. But don't be scared. It could happen to any one of us. I'm going to the office to get his information. Maybe I'll find something that helps us understand better." I just nodded. I was still frightened, but what he said made sense. And as unexplainable as it was, this feeling made me sympathize with the deceased even more. It was an empathy that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. I remained by his side, observing his hands. They were rough, strong, with visible calluses, signs of someone who had worked hard his entire life. It reminded me of my husband, who spent years working in the fields, a laborer just like the man on the gurney, and without even thinking, I took his hand as a gesture of respect and companionship. His fingers were cold, rigid, but the touch confirmed what I'd already noticed. He was someone who knew the weight of work. I murmured a few quiet words, saying that we were there for him. But when I tried to let go of his hand, something unimaginable happened. I distinctly felt him hold it. My breathing stopped, my hands went cold. I pulled back gently, but his fingers wouldn't release. It was a firm grip, impossible to ignore. My whole body went cold with goosebumps, and by instinct I lifted my gaze to his face. He was staring at me with his eyes open, but they weren't just open, they were wide, as if he were making a superhuman effort to keep them that way. His eyes were fixed on me, and the expression I saw, I can't fully describe it. But it was something that made me feel a visceral fear, like in that instant I saw something I wasn't meant to see. I yanked my hand free with a quick pull and ran out of the room. A few seconds later, Lorenzo appeared, probably alerted by my panic. Panting, I told him what had happened. He listened in silence. We didn't go back into the room right away. We stayed outside for a while, trying to process it. His name was Name. He came from a humble family, my boss said, still deep in thought. Looking at the info they gave me, there's nothing that explains this, unless the family did something unusual. It happens, but I have another suspicion. I looked at him, waiting. This man had diabetes in a very advanced stage. If he had survived the accident, he would have had only a few more months to live. Maybe weeks. I'm not sure, but the doctors saw no hope. He paused and sighed. I can't say for certain, but I've heard similar stories before. Maybe they decided to let him go. And the problem is that he didn't want to. His words struck me in a strange way, because deep down it made sense. We went back to the room and found the body in a different position. His hand, which had just been holding mine, now hung beside the gurney. His eyes were still open, but just staring at the ceiling. That awful expression was gone. They were just empty. After that, the rest of the work went by without incident. The day carried on normally, as if none of it had happened. When I left, the job was finished. The family would arrive very early the next day. Before leaving, I approached him one last time. I looked at him without fear, trying to see beyond the image that had frightened me earlier. Within my beliefs, I thanked him for letting us carry out our work. Then I went home. What happened next, however, is something I still can't explain to this day. I parked, went inside, and found my husband in the living room. He was sitting there watching me, but something was off about him. His face had an expression I had never seen before, and never saw again after that day. He looked frozen. He didn't move, didn't blink, barely turned his head to follow me as I came in. And the scariest part, he was pale. Very pale. I've never seen anyone that pale and still alive. My heart raced. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, but at first glance everything seemed fine. He stood up slowly to greet me, but his movements were heavy, sluggish, as if he were in shock. Something had happened, and I knew I was about to find out what. Of course, I asked if he was okay and what had happened. His answer, however, left me incredulous to this day. It made no sense at all. He said that about 20 minutes before I arrived, he was sitting on the couch watching television, waiting for me. We had been texting, arranging what he wanted me to buy. After he gave me the list, I left for the store and sent him one more message letting him know I was heading back. But he didn't reply. I figured he was in the kitchen busy with dinner. Indeed, that was the plan. He would start preparing the meal. But then someone knocked on the door. He knew it wasn't me, since we both have keys to the apartment, which is on the second floor. Before opening, he looked through the peephole and almost lost his breath. Standing outside the door was exactly the same man I had seen on the gurney that day. Identical, with the same appearance he had in the hospital. The shock was immediate. His first thought was that maybe someone in the building had hurt themselves and needed help. He backed away from the peephole, unlocked the door, and there was no one there. The fear made him go back to the couch, stunned, trying to understand what he had just seen. Soon after, I arrived. So as not to worry him even more, I said it might have been a mistake, that maybe he was just tired and imagined it. But inside, I knew it wasn't just in his head. His description of the man's face was way too accurate. And the scariest part, my husband didn't even know who I had worked on that afternoon. It wasn't a coincidence. I felt uneasy. What did that man want? How did he reach our home? I've heard stories of spirits who remain here for a while, stuck between two worlds, but after that day he never appeared again. Not to me, nor to anyone in my family. Months later, I told my husband the whole story. He was visibly shaken but tried to be rational. He said maybe that man just wanted to thank me. But how would he know where I lived? And why show up right when I wasn't there? These questions remain unanswered, and it was, without a doubt, the most remarkable and unexplainable experience of my life. To this day, I don't fully understand what happened. Will we ever grasp what's on the other side? How it all works? Is it possible to come back, wander around here for a while, have permission to say goodbye? And what about you? What do you think of all this? Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. Good evening, Dom. Since I'm standing here waiting for the bus, I thought I'd take the time to share a story that happened to me a few years ago. I've never told this to anyone because even now, it's hard to accept that it really happened. But I can guarantee everything I'm about to recount was completely real. My morning routine has always included waking up at 4:30 to exercise and leaving a little after 6, just in time to catch public transportation to work. I live in an apartment complex in a quiet area, not too far from a well-known lake in the city. One day, as usual, I woke up at 4, but something was different. You know those days when you wake up completely refreshed, without the slightest trace of fatigue? That's how I felt. I went through my routine as normal with one extra detail. I put my phone in my pants pocket before leaving. Before locking the door, I did my usual check: wallet, money, cards, keys, and phone. But at the last second, I doubted whether I had actually put my keys away. I reached into my pocket to confirm my phone was there, but it wasn't. I checked the clock, 5 minutes to 6. I went back inside, searched in my usual spots, and found my keys. However, in the process, I left my phone on the entryway table and walked out without it. That's when things started to get strange. I live on the 3rd floor in an area slightly elevated, so every morning I'm greeted by a cool breeze the moment I step outside. But that morning, the air was still, completely motionless. I found it odd but kept walking toward the bus terminal. Still inside the complex, something caught my attention. The dogs that usually roam the area were nowhere to be seen. They're unpredictable. Sometimes they ignore people, other times they bark for no reason, but that morning nothing, not a single sign of them. I continued down the street, and a few blocks later I saw a woman dressed far too elegantly for a regular weekday. She walked calmly and turned the corner, heading toward the terminal. I followed the same path but kept a good distance, something I always do to avoid startling people at that hour. If someone is walking slowly and there isn't much space, I prefer to wait before passing them. After about a block, she seemed to notice my presence and suddenly stopped. I thought she was letting me pass. When I was about 3 meters away from her, I made a subtle detour to ensure I wouldn't get too close. At that moment, she turned her head to look straight at me. "Good morning," I greeted her with a slight nod, avoiding direct eye contact. She didn't respond. She just stared at me, motionless, as if trying to figure something out. Her face twisted into a strange expression, a mix of shock and discomfort. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was because of my height. I'm about 6 feet tall, while she barely reached 5'3". It was still dark, and the early morning hours can amplify feelings of vulnerability. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, I had the distinct feeling that I was caught in something far bigger than just a simple, awkward encounter. I walked away, but I still felt the weight of her gaze on me. I glanced at her from the corner of my eye. She was still there, motionless, staring at me as if trying to decipher something. I chose to ignore it and kept walking. Soon I was near the street leading to the terminal. In the distance, I could see the long line for the first bus, while the second line was almost empty. Since I had left much earlier than usual, I didn't find it strange. As I approached, something unsettling happened. The people in line stopped whatever they were doing and turned their eyes toward me. I stood at the front of the empty line waiting for the second bus, but I couldn't ignore the way they were looking at me. Their stares were intense, similar to the woman I had left behind. Some whispered among themselves, as if sharing a secret I wasn't part of. Suddenly, an elderly woman turned to me and without hesitation said, "Young man, you shouldn't be here." Her words caught me off guard. "What?" She leaned in slightly and repeated, "You can't get on those combis." The word triggered a memory of my grandmother. She used to call small buses combis, not quite vans, but smaller than regular buses. Before I could process what she meant, one of these vehicles pulled up, and people started boarding quickly. On the front display, I saw the number 7. "But you must not get on that one," the woman insisted. I stood frozen, watching the crowd squeeze into the bus until it pulled away. I was still trying to make sense of the situation when a man, who looked to be around 40, approached. His expression was serious and his voice firm. "Sir, that bus is only for people like you. Not only can you not get on, but you shouldn't even be here." There was something unsettling in the way he said "you." His tone carried a weight that made me uneasy. "I'm sorry, but I always take the bus to the city center," I explained, confused. The man took a deep breath, clearly impatient. "That's exactly why I'm telling you, you shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." He stepped forward, and his authoritative tone felt like an order. Instinctively, I took a step back, and that's when I noticed that everyone still in line was facing me, as if waiting for my next move. A chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong. I did what anyone would do. I ran. The way back home had never felt so long. I mentally calculated that at least 30 minutes must have passed since I left. I reached into my pocket wanting to check the time, but then remembered I had left my phone at home, and that's when I saw her. On the same street I had walked down earlier, the woman was still there, standing, staring, just like before. I rushed inside, locked the door, and tried to catch my breath. My heart pounded in my chest. I went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, sat down, and waited for my mind to calm. When I finally felt a bit more clear-headed, I stood up to check the time, resigned to the fact that I'd be late for work after everything that had happened. But the clock read 6:10 in the morning, 10 minutes, just 10 minutes. How was that possible? Confused, I stepped outside again. This time the cold morning wind wrapped around me as usual. The dogs barked at my presence. The woman was gone. The buses were running their normal routes. The 2 usual lines were back in place. Everything was exactly as it should be. Ever since that day, I've wondered if, for a brief moment, I crossed into another world. Many believe the dead can visit the land of the living, and maybe in the same way, we too can cross over into their world without even realizing it. The difference is ghosts know where they are. We, the living, do everything we can to deny the possibility of encountering death. But what if one day it doesn't give us a choice? It wasn't that long ago when this happened, right at the moment I finally met in person the classmates I had been studying with in high school. We had started the course during a remote learning period, and despite the distance, 3 of us formed a strong bond, almost as if we had been childhood friends. Our conversations flowed naturally through social media and then extended to a popular game. One of us even had the habit of staying online until late hours without worrying about bedtime. At first, it didn't catch our attention. After all, it was something common among teenagers. When the time finally came for us to attend in-person classes and meet each other for the first time, it felt like we had known each other for years. The connection was immediate, and in fact, we are great friends to this day. But what I'm about to tell you happened precisely during that first week we spent together in person. I'll call them Marcos and Jeff. I prefer to keep my own name and any other details secret. Jeff, as he'll be referred to from now on, made it clear that I could share this story as long as there was nothing that could identify him. You'll soon understand why. We got along so well that our classmates believed we already knew each other from somewhere else, maybe from a previous school. The chemistry was impressive, almost as if we had reunited with distant relatives. We shared the same taste in anime, played the same games, and had a similar sense of humor. We got along so well that right from the start we decided to do our weekend homework together, even though it wasn't necessarily a group assignment. The teachers didn't even encourage in-person meetings for safety reasons, but since we were already vaccinated, we figured there wouldn't be a problem. Our plan was simple. As soon as class ended on Friday, we would head straight to Jeff's house, get our homework done, and then enjoy our free time playing video games. Jeff mentioned that his mother, with whom he lived alone, would only arrive late at night. He said he didn't mind having us over, and if we stayed too late, we could even spend the night. He seemed excited not to have to face another Friday by himself. I was also drawn to the idea. It had been a while since I had friends to spend an evening like that with. I've always been more reserved, with few friendships, and it seemed they felt the same way. We were so alike and socially isolated that meeting up felt more like a reunion of cousins who had never met before. Jeff's house was easy to get to, located on a street parallel to a major boulevard in the city, but at the far end of it, where there was much less traffic. His house was set a bit higher than the avenue, so from his bedroom window you could see almost the entire stretch of the boulevard. I knew that area well. As a child, I used to go there with my father for work, especially on Saturdays, payday. Everything went as planned. We organized ourselves well so we could finish our tasks quickly, dividing the duties efficiently. By mid-afternoon, we had already done almost everything and could finally play. We settled into Jeff's room, each of us grabbing a controller to play together on the TV. Time passed without us noticing. When I looked at the clock, it was already 9 at night. We were sitting with our backs to the window overlooking the boulevard. From time to time, I would turn around to look. Gradually, I noticed the avenue seemed emptier and emptier, as if everyone in the neighborhood had suddenly decided to just stop going through there. We were interrupted by the phone ringing. Jeff ran to answer it. On the other end of the line, a friend of his was in the midst of an anxiety attack. She was alone with her younger sister just a few blocks away. Without thinking twice, Jeff said he needed to go there to stay with her until her father or older sister arrived. He grabbed his bike and vanished into the darkness of the neighborhood. Marcos and I went back to the room, but we no longer felt like playing. We just talked, while my gaze kept drifting toward the avenue. The silence outside seemed unnatural. Only a single streetlight illuminated the far corner, casting a weak, solitary glow on the road. That's when we heard a strange sound. At first, we thought someone was knocking on the front door, but there was no one there. We soon realized the noise was coming from the backyard, a space filled with old junk right below Jeff's window. We approached it, trying to pinpoint exactly where the noise was coming from. I climbed up on something. I think it was an old washing machine, so I could see over the wooden fence that separated the yard from the lot behind the house. On the other side, in the darkness, I could see the back of a building that faced the boulevard, but at a much lower level, with about a 4-meter drop. In that absolute darkness, 2 figures were trying to force open a back door. I called Marcos to look with me. We watched, unsure of what to do. We thought about throwing something at them to scare them off. But what if they weren't thieves? What if they were just employees locked out? We had no idea what was going on. Suddenly, Marcos shouted without thinking, "Hey, drop that!" The 2 figures froze instantly. The noise stopped. That was when, for the first time, I could make out their outlines more clearly. They were wearing something that looked like white hooded robes, or maybe tunics. It was hard to say for sure. But what struck me most was the glow in their eyes. They reflected a light that simply wasn't there on our side. As soon as they noticed us, they started climbing the dirt slope that separated the building from the back of Jeff's house. The incline was steep, almost 4 meters high. It shouldn't have been easy to climb it so quickly. Without thinking twice, we bolted, fear taking hold of us. We ran straight to the front of the house, but we were sure those figures were already near the wooden fence. We heard muffled sounds, as if someone was trying to jump or force something open. The fright came from the front, a scream. It was Jeff's mother who had just arrived. Even though she knew we would be there, she was startled to see us running from the backyard to the street. We tried to explain, asking her not to go in alone, telling her someone was trying to break in from the back. She, however, ignored our warnings and went to check for herself. We had no choice but to follow her. But there was nothing there anymore. The lot behind the house was empty, no sign of the figures we had seen just minutes earlier. We explained that they had just been there, that they must have fled when they heard us. But Jeff's mother didn't seem interested in our story. No one got in, and I'm not saying anything to Jeff. If he's already paranoid, this will only make it worse. What's back there is even worse. Without offering further explanations, she went into the room and left us there, not understanding a thing. Marcos and I looked at each other. We didn't want to go back to Jeff's room. The window opened directly onto the backyard, facing the boulevard, right where we'd seen those figures. So we decided to stay in the living room. Jeff came back about half an hour later. As soon as he walked in, he sensed something was off. He stared at us for a moment before asking what had happened. But since his mother had asked us not to say anything, we chose to keep the story a secret. We only said we needed to leave. Marcos and I left together, heading to the avenue where we would catch a taxi. The walk felt longer than usual, with every shadow making us uneasy. We crossed the street on purpose, walking on the opposite side as far as possible from that house and whatever might be lurking behind it. That was when I felt Marcos grip my shoulder tightly. I tried to understand what he wanted to say, but no words came out. I followed his gaze, and in that moment, everything made sense. The building behind Jeff's house, the one where we had seen those 2 figures trying to open the door, had a sign visible from the other side of the street. A clear sign, impossible to ignore. Legal Medical Service, Municipal Morgue. That was enough to send us into a frantic run. We ran non-stop until we reached a bigger avenue, where we finally felt far enough from that disturbing sight. We spent the rest of the night at my house, which was closer. We didn't have the courage to go back outside. Not for a moment. On Monday, we finally told Jeff everything. He listened in silence, and when we finished, let out a deep sigh. Then, in a resigned tone, he revealed, "That's exactly why I hate living there. I can't stand sleeping in that house. Whenever I can, I stay up playing games until morning, just to avoid looking outside or hearing anything." He told us that on several occasions, he had seen those same silhouettes wandering behind the morgue. He said they seemed to be crying in a way that sent chills down his spine. But the worst part was when, out of curiosity or impulse, he peeked out the window. Because whenever he did that, they would stop and turn to stare at him with those glowing eyes. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. What if I told you that from time to time there are bodies in the morgue that no one wants to handle alone? Employees avoid being alone with them. preferring not to go near them at all. And why? You might be wondering. Well, that's exactly what we're going to find out now. To preserve the identity of the person who shared this story, names have been changed and the location will not be mentioned. I want to begin my account on an afternoon at the hospital where I still work, more specifically in the morgue. It was at that moment that Mr. Braga approached as usual, showering me with over-the-top compliments, a clear sign he was about to ask me for a favor. "My dear friend, so good to see you. How are you today? Ready to face another night of work? You know, there's no one around here quite like you. Even the dead must break into a smile when they see you coming." That was how he greeted me the moment he saw me walk in that night. "Good evening, Braga. Enough with that. If there's anyone who scares the stiffs around here, it's you. They don't smile, they cry. I hope you took it easy on them today. They're already dead. They don't need more suffering from your chatter," I replied in the same tone, smiling. He laughed but continued with his flattery as I signed in. I knew him well. His compliments always hid a request. To cut the conversation short, I decided to go straight to the point. "All right, Braga, what do you want this time?" He put an arm around my shoulders and as we walked down the corridor, lowered his voice to avoid curious ears. "Today is my ex-wife's birthday. You know, we've been divorced for years, but we're still connected because of the kids. And of course, they called me asking me to go to her place for dinner. Everyone's going to be there. I'd invite you too, but well, you're on duty, right? So here it is. A body arrived a little over an hour ago, and to be honest, I haven't even started working on it. Just by looking at it, I knew it'd be one of those complicated cases." He looked at me sideways, waiting for my reaction. "You know what I'm talking about, right? One of those special ones that require time, patience, finesse. And since I know you love a challenge, I thought it would be unfair not to offer you this opportunity. Don't take it the wrong way, colleague. I'm not trying to exploit your goodwill, but today I really can't be late. You know my ex-wife and how my kids are. If I arrive late, I'll never hear the end of it." Braga took a deep breath and finished his request. "Can you take this autopsy for me, but you have to start with this body, all right? It's already on the table waiting for you. Oh, and, of course, let's keep this between us." When he referred to a special body, he meant the kind nobody wanted, cases requiring more technique and patience. Still, I wasn't sure if that was the real reason, or if he just wanted to leave work early. His ex-wife hated him, but for the kids' sake, he was willing to do anything, even endure a birthday dinner he probably would rather avoid. All of us who worked there knew Dr. Braga well enough to be familiar with his personal life, especially his penchant for spending money on certain women on the weekends. Because of that, my suspicions were split between two motives. Maybe he truly didn't want to deal with that difficult case, or maybe he just wanted to leave earlier. But ultimately, it didn't matter. I didn't mind helping him, so long as no one realized he was gone and he repaid the favor later, and so he left. When I went into the morgue and saw the body on the table, I instantly understood why that rascal hadn't even tried to start on it. One glance was enough to see that it was an elderly, homeless man. The body was in a deplorable state, filthy with disheveled, tangled hair and a long, completely neglected beard. A few meters away, his clothes lay in a heap, just as dirty and foul-smelling as he was. What shocked me most were the injuries, marks all over his skin, seemingly bite marks from small animals, as if they had fed on him. If any detail is too graphic, I apologize, but it's important to understand the scene. The man no longer had eyelids or eyes. His half-open mouth showed the absence of his lower lip and part of his nose. He also had no ears, and some fingers were missing. On top of that, the swelling suggested decomposition was well underway. Everything pointed to the fact that it had taken a long time for anyone to find him. I headed to the desk to check if Braga had at least started the report. There was only one note. Apparent cause of death: rats fed on him while he was still alive, probably while he was unconscious due to intoxication. In other words, according to Braga, the man was drunk when he was attacked. After reading that, I had to take a deep breath. I went to the bathroom in the room, turned on the faucet and splashed some water on my face. But it wasn't so much to prepare for the work as it was a reflex for the numbness I felt when I pictured that terrible scene. A few drops ran down my chin before I pulled myself together. Even with years of experience in the morgue, the sight of that body made me queasy. I got ready and started the autopsy. I had barely made the first incision in the chest when I suddenly heard the faucet turn on. The sound of running water echoed around me. I stood still for a moment. Had I left the faucet partially open? I put the scalpel down on the instrument table and went to check. That's when I got a fright. In the sink, struggling against the flow of water, there was a small rat, desperately trying to escape. My first instinct was to find something to help it. I turned around quickly, spotted a broom leaning against the corner of the room, and rushed back to rescue the creature. But when I looked at the sink again, nothing. The rat had simply vanished. I searched all around the bathroom, checking every corner. Nothing, no trace of it. I turned off the faucet and walked back into the room, completely baffled. There I was, surrounded by corpses, with an elderly homeless man lying before me, and yet my mind was stuck on finding an animal that had been there mere seconds ago and now simply wasn't. And all of that right there in the morgue. I was still holding the broom when I heard the faucet turn on again. This time the water flowed slowly, as though someone had turned the handle very gradually. I proceeded with caution, each step filled with hesitation. I didn't know what to expect. But one thing was certain, there was no longer any sign of a rat. What I did see, however, made me freeze. The sink was full, the water standing there, not draining, but that wasn't the worst of it. It was red. I dropped the broom immediately and tried to step back, but my legs gave out and I collapsed to the floor. In that moment, I saw something even more disturbing. The faucet turning on its own, cutting off the water supply while the red liquid slowly disappeared down the drain, as though it had never been there. I picked myself up as best I could and hurried out of the room, breathing heavily. Out in the corridor, I rested my hands on my knees, trying to steady my heartbeat, which felt like it was about to explode out of my chest. I stayed like that for several minutes, waiting for the feeling to subside. Fortunately, nobody appeared to see me like that. I wouldn't have been able to explain it, neither to them nor to myself. Once I felt I could breathe again, I tried to think rationally. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the lighting, maybe my tired mind playing tricks. I decided to go back, determined to look at the sink again to prove to myself that it had just been a momentary hallucination. And indeed, when I re-entered, everything looked normal. No standing water, nothing red, no rat. Only the homeless man's body on the autopsy table waiting for me. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and chose to lean on something bigger. I made the sign of the cross and quietly asked for clarity of mind and for the soul of the deceased to find peace. Then I resumed my work. For quite a while nothing strange happened. But then it did. In the middle of the autopsy, while examining the internal organs, I felt something unusual, a different texture. I kept working, investigating. My stomach twisted when I realized what it was. Remains of rats, pieces scattered throughout the digestive tract, lodged in the throat. The more I looked, the more I found. And then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. Instinctively, my gaze shifted to the corpse's mouth, or what was left of it. There was movement there, tiny, subtle, but real. I focused my eyes. No, it couldn't be, but it was. Inside the dead man's slightly open mouth, there was a living rat. My heart pounded. Even after all my years in the morgue, I wasn't prepared for that. We had strict pest control measures. I'd never seen a single rodent in there. Why then were they appearing now with this body? Was it just coincidence? If so, it was too big of a coincidence. Still trying to maintain composure, I attempted to remove the animal from the corpse, but as soon as I got near, the rat slipped down the man's throat, vanishing inside him. I dropped everything and ran. I raced through the hospital to a colleague's office, the only person who might listen without assuming I was out of my mind. The moment he saw me, he could tell how shaken I was. More than the story itself, my expression startled him. He didn't know what to say, he just listened. After a few minutes, I begged him to come with me to the morgue. I needed someone else to witness it. I needed confirmation, an explanation. He agreed, but when we got there, everything was normal. The corpse was exactly as I'd left it, chest open with no changes, no sign of rodents, no new bite marks, nothing to prove what I'd seen. My colleague gave me a hesitant look and asked if I wanted him to stay with me. I said I didn't need company. He urged me to stop working and go home to rest. He said it was clear I wasn't well. I thanked him for his advice, but told him I'd at least finish that body. I needed to complete it that very night. He said goodbye and left, leaving me alone once again. The worst had passed. Nothing else happened while I finished up the autopsy. All that remained was writing the report. The place was quiet, and for the first time that night, I felt calmer. I decided to rest for a moment before wrapping everything up. I sat in a chair by the desk, facing the corpse that had given me the worst night of my career so far. My thoughts wandered. I thought about the report, the shift, and what I had experienced. Had it really been real? Or was it just the result of extreme fatigue? I leaned my head back and took a deep breath. That was when I heard a sound. A faint squeak, but unmistakable. It came from the floor. I looked down, and the moment I did, my whole body froze. There, casually moving around my feet as though it belonged there, was a rat. But not just any rat. It was the same one I had seen in the sink. It moved unhurriedly, without fear, as if the place belonged to it, not me. At one point it stopped, lifted its head, and rose on its hind legs, staring right at me. Its tiny snout twitched rapidly, like it was sniffing me from a distance. My immediate instinct was to pull my feet back and prepare to kick it hard. But before I could do so, a metallic noise rang through the room. The autopsy table creaked. My eyes shot up reflexively, leaving the rat for just an instant. And that's when I saw it. The corpse was sitting up, facing me, its head slowly tilted to the side as if observing me, but that was impossible. It had no eyes, only two gaping, swollen sockets, dark like endless pits. I wanted to move, to run, to scream, but nothing answered. My body refused to cooperate. Then the last image I recall from that scene, its jaw coming loose, simply detaching from the face and falling to the ground while it remained there, staring at me with those empty sockets. I don't remember exactly what happened after that. Everything went blurry. The only certainty I have is that my colleague found me there, collapsed, unable to move. As soon as he walked in, he let out a curse, shaken by the sight. He ran over, pushed the body back onto the metal table, and got me out of there. I spent months in therapy after that day. The doctor who rescued me said he saw the body sit up, which was already unbelievable enough, given how long it had been dead. Beyond that, he saw nothing else. No rat, no new wounds. Nothing of what I had witnessed existed for anyone but me. The truth? We never found out who that man really was. The most I managed to learn was that he'd been found lifeless under a bridge, being devoured by rats. That spot was notorious in local rumors. People claimed it was frequented by individuals involved in occult practices and dark rituals. I never considered going there to check if any of that was true. I preferred to leave that question unanswered. After a few weeks off, I came back to work. But it would be a full year before I could handle a night shift completely on my own again. Throughout that period, there was always someone with me, just in case at my colleague's insistence, or maybe just to ensure I wouldn't lose my mind alone. Even today, I'm still here. They say that when a body is handed over to forces we don't understand and would rather not name, neither matter nor spirit finds rest. That the soul continues to wander, not only in the depths of the unknown, but among us as well. Perhaps this account is proof of that. Good evening, Dom. My experience was brief, but it left a mark on my life that haunts me to this day. During a period of work, I served as an assistant to a forensic doctor in a hospital. I was completely inexperienced, but I also didn't believe in supernatural phenomena or anything of the sort. My shift was at night, and a colleague who had already gone through the same job made sure to warn me. Strange things happen in the middle of the night, but don't worry. Just keep doing your job and ignore it. Being naturally skeptical, I didn't pay much attention to his comment. One of those nights, the doctor asked me to go to the cold chamber to check the number of bodies stored there. I walked down the long, dimly lit corridor that led to the place. Some light bulbs were burnt out, leaving the environment in an unsettling twilight. It was a public hospital, so you can imagine the poor conditions. As soon as I entered, I started counting. Everything seemed normal until, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a subtle movement. One of the bodies, covered by a sheet, seemed to have shifted slightly, as if its head had turned just a little. My heart pounded and I turned abruptly. With my nerves on edge, I slowly approached and pulled the sheet back. What I saw confirmed my worst fear. The head of the corpse was now facing exactly in my direction. A chill ran down my spine, and an eerie coldness took over my body. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself it was just a trick of my mind. So, I covered the body again and forced myself to continue the task. The silence was absolute, but seconds later it was shattered by a sound I will never forget. A low, dragging moan coming from the back of the room. A male voice filled with pain and despair. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to turn around to understand what was happening. Without a second thought, I ran as fast as my legs would carry me. I only stopped when I reached the doctor's office. I was shaking, completely out of breath, pale, unable to say a single word. For a moment I thought about telling him what had happened, but I hesitated. The doctor looked at me for a few seconds without saying anything, but his eyes said it all. He had seen that expression before. He knew. At that moment, all I wanted was for the sun to rise so I could leave. I never wanted to go back, but I had to. The job wasn't over yet. In the following months, other things happened, but that is a story for another day. My name is Nathan, and today I want to share with you a defining episode of my life. I've been working as a forensic pathologist for a decade, dealing with bodies in all sorts of conditions, always accustomed to the solitary routine of morgues. Late nights are my usual work hours, so silence and darkness have never bothered me. But when I started working at that particular morgue, something changed. The night shift was shared with a colleague, and at first everything seemed normal until that night. It was past midnight when we received the body of an elderly woman in an advanced state of decomposition. The staff responsible for collecting the cadavers told us that she had lived alone, without family, and that the neighbors only realized she had died because of the unbearable stench coming from her house. We followed the standard procedures, performed the autopsy, recorded the reports, and finally placed her in the cold chamber. Everything was done without incident. After finishing our work, my colleague and I decided to take a short break. Between sips of coffee and casual conversation, we noticed a strange sensation in the air. An invisible weight seemed to spread through the room, making the air thick, uncomfortable. We exchanged glances, trying to ignore the sudden unease. That's when the silence of the night was broken by a dry, unmistakable sound, the metallic creak of a door opening. We froze, listening to the echo of the noise. The sound came from the cold storage area. "Did you hear that?" my colleague asked, his voice slightly shaky. "Yeah, it sounded like it came from there." Wasting no time, we walked together to the source of the sound. As I opened the door to the corridor, a shiver ran down my spine. Only one of the refrigerated chambers was open, the elderly woman's. My partner looked at me, clearly uneasy. "Are you sure you locked that door properly?" I nodded firmly. Not only had I closed it, but I had also locked it with a padlock. That door couldn't have been open. My instincts told me it was impossible, yet standing there, staring at the open chamber, something made me doubt logic itself. I didn't want to feed my colleague's fear. He didn't have much experience in the morgue yet, so I tried to sound calm. I suggested that the door was simply old, that maybe the latch was worn out. Without giving room for panic, we shut the chamber once more and returned to our routine. The hours passed. My partner left to use the restroom while I organized some paperwork. The silence of the morgue was suddenly shattered by a muffled scream. "Nathan," I ran to the restroom. When I opened the door, I saw my colleague standing in front of the stalls, his eyes wide, breathing heavily. "What happened? What's wrong?" I asked, feeling a cold chill creep over me. He pointed at one of the stalls, his hand trembling, his voice barely audible. The old woman." My mind took a few seconds to process. "What old woman?" "The woman we brought in tonight," he whispered, still staring at the stall. I saw her, in the mirror's reflection. She was there, standing at the door, watching me. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. All I could do was try to calm him down, telling him his mind was playing tricks on him because of the eerie events of the night. The elderly woman was dead. There was no logic in believing she had moved, but he wouldn't take his eyes off the stall, terrified, insisting he had seen her. He described every detail with precision, The same face, the pale skin, and the bruised eye, exactly as when the body arrived. I felt a tightness in my chest, seeing him so shaken. He truly believed what he was saying. I suggested that he go home and rest, assuring him I would handle the rest of the shift. Maybe he just needed a break, a few hours away from the oppressive atmosphere. He agreed, but before leaving he grabbed my arm and begged me to be careful. He had no doubts about what he saw. The truth is, I was unsettled too, but I forced myself to focus on work. There were still other autopsies to be performed. Time passed, and about an hour later, as I concentrated on another examination, the lights started flickering. At first it was brief intervals, then they went out completely. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way down the corridor toward the fuse box. But as soon as I turned the corner, my breath caught in my throat. She was there, the elderly woman, sitting on one of the gurneys, motionless, staring at me. Shock paralyzed me, and then the worst happened. Without moving her lips, she let out a low, dragging laugh, a sound so disturbing it sent ice through my veins. My instincts screamed. I turned and ran without looking back. At that exact moment, the power returned. I stopped, hesitating, trying to catch my breath before turning around again. But there was nothing there. The corridor was empty, as if I had imagined everything. I couldn't stay alone in that place any longer. I grabbed my phone and called the doctor, the morgue's owner, explaining everything that had happened. He came immediately. While I waited outside, trying to pull myself together, he simply asked if I was okay. I nodded, but the truth was I wasn't. We went in together to check on the elderly woman's body. There she was, intact, exactly where we had left her. The doctor took over for the rest of the night and sent me home. The next day, when I returned for my shift, he shared something that sent another wave of chills down my spine. "You weren't wrong," he said, his expression grim. "Something really strange is happening here." He told me that during the night, he had clearly heard a woman's laughter coming from the cold chamber. The same laugh I had heard. Because of this, he decided to look into the woman's history, trying to find any relatives who might claim the body and take it away. But what he discovered was even worse. Everyone in the neighborhood feared her. They said she had never had family or friends and had lived her life in complete isolation. Children avoided walking past her house because they claimed she was always watching them from the window. Some residents swore she practiced black magic, that at night cries could be heard from her home, along with strange smells and even black smoke seeping through the cracks. The rumors were endless, but one stood out. Once she had allegedly tried to take a 5-year-old girl. The child's brother saw it happen, managed to pull her away, and ran home with her. No adult dared to take action. They were all too afraid. People who had conflicts with her in the past had died in inexplicable ways. The doctor said that while listening to all this, an unbearable weight pressed on his chest, a feeling impossible to describe, and the only certainty we had was that the body needed to be removed. A neighbor suggested cremation. She said no one would come to claim the body, and if it were buried in some way, the old woman would continue haunting the place. The idea seemed absurd, but after everything that had happened, no one wanted to take chances. The decision was made quickly. That very night, the elderly woman was incinerated, and from that moment on, everything changed. The suffocating sensation of fear and anguish vanished. The atmosphere returned to normal, and the unease that had haunted us for so many nights simply disappeared. The days passed, and the morgue's corridors never again witnessed unexplained events. I continued working there for 5 more years. Nothing like that ever happened again. But that experience remained etched in me as a dark reminder. Evil can persist in ways we cannot explain. Some presences remain even after death. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. My name is Simone, and for years I have worked as a forensic doctor. During this time I have witnessed countless situations in morgues, as it is undeniable that these places harbor peculiar occurrences. It's not uncommon, after all. Many of the people who arrive here have died suddenly and violently. I've always had the feeling that those who depart so abruptly struggle to move on. And even though my training is deeply rooted in science, I cannot ignore certain episodes that make me believe there is something beyond our understanding. Among the many experiences I have accumulated over the years, one in particular has always stayed with me. That night, I was working alone in the morgue, accompanied only by the security guard on duty. Around 2 a.m, the body of an 18-year-old girl arrived. She had been hit by a car just a few hours earlier. I recorded the necessary details, and as soon as the paramedics left, I began the autopsy. I won't go into detail, but her injuries were severe. Her condition deeply affected me. After the procedure, I went to the security guard to ask if any relatives had come looking for her. He replied that no one had contacted them yet. I took advantage of the break to go to the restroom, and as I was returning, I heard his voice from a distance speaking to someone. I quickened my pace, thinking a family member might have arrived. I dried my hands and walked to the waiting room, but to my surprise, he was alone. "Who was here just now?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was a young woman. She said she was lost and asked for help getting home. She seemed confused, but I couldn't leave my post, so I explained where she could catch a taxi. She thanked me and left. I found it odd, but I didn't dwell on it and returned to work. The rest of the night went on as usual, until suddenly the girl's body fell off the stretcher without any explanation. The sound of the impact against the floor sent chills down my spine. There was no one else there but me, and given the way she had been positioned, there was no way she could have fallen on her own. Unable to lift the body by myself, I went to the security guard to ask for help. He agreed and followed me back to the room. But as soon as he saw the girl's body, all the color drained from his face. He stood there frozen, staring at her. "What is it?" I asked, sensing the tension in the air. His voice came out shaky. "It's her. She's the one who came asking for help earlier. I'm absolutely sure. Even the tattoo on her right arm is the same." My body went cold. The air felt heavy, and all I could manage to say was, "Are you sure?" He nodded quickly, still pale. Together we placed the body back on the stretcher and left the room. The silence between us spoke louder than any words. The only thing we could murmur afterward was that maybe that poor soul hadn't yet realized what had happened to her. Maybe she just wanted to go home. But more than fear that night, I felt immense sadness. She was a young girl whose life had been abruptly taken away, and from what it seemed, she hadn't even realized she was no longer among us. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.